Some of the elders would reflect immediately, why are you doing this? We've never been at the table and our voice is not meaningfully heard. But they were still interested in understanding how there could be change.
If you find hunting and views that are not disrupted by human intervention, small family ranches are maintaining that. They're predicting $24 trillion worth of land is going to transfer in the next 20 years. Where do we think that's going to go? It's going to go to the wealthy. At this point, nobody can afford to go into it.
As more and more people move here, we have a different change of values. That's where I find a lot of friction because I see places that have changed hands, and now I see no trespassing signs on beaches in the high water mark.
What's the 80% of the things that we can all agree that we want out of this group together? And during the time in which we focused on that 80%, people got to know each other. And we had barbecues. People spent more time going to these meetings than they normally would because they actually wanted to see the partners.
Welcome to the Stories for Action podcast, where we aim to elevate stories and spark connections to benefit the health of people and place. I'm your host, Laura Tomov. In November, at the end of 2024, we hosted a public screening of one of the films in the Life in the Land series, which Stories for Action produces. Life in the Land is a series of 6 films and several podcasts under this series that hears from folks in rural communities around Montana, speaking to the value in community-guided and collaborative and holistic approaches that not only benefit the health of the landscapes, but also the well-being of the communities, the people that are a part of that landscape. One of these films is called The Upper Yellowstone River, which looks at the stretch of the river in an area commonly known as Paradise Valley. The film hears from a local rancher, a river restoration expert, an outdoor recreation business owner, and a traditional ecological knowledge educator, who are all deeply connected to this river. They speak to how, no matter if the challenge is drought, flood, impact from increased river recreation or development, or otherwise, that greater resilience for the people and place can be achieved when the responses are guided by the local community and guided by the river itself, and if the responses are collaborative in nature, even though that process is often messy and the path of greater resistance. A key objective of the Life in the Land films is to have them serve as educational films, free and available for community groups or organizations to show one of the films or a clip of the film to kick off deeper dialogue around these topics. So we hosted a screening of this film in Missoula, Montana, a region that has similar dynamics featured in the film. Missoula is a small city and area that's centered around rivers. Literally, the Missoula Valley is the intersection of 5 valleys, where 3 major rivers come together. There's a great deal of conservation presence there, family agriculture, though they're under increasing pressures, an economy driven by outdoor recreation, largely centered around the river, and past and present connections for Native people. This area is homeland to the Salish, Kalispel, and many other tribes who have had close connection to this place and the rivers for thousands of years. The Flathead Reservation is also not far away. Plus, a great deal of tribal members reside in Missoula and the surrounding areas today, connecting with these rivers in a variety of ways. So what you'll hear in today's podcast episode is the recording of the panel and community conversation that we had after the screening of the Upper Yellowstone River film in Missoula. Panelists included Brian Chaffin, Executive Director of the Clark Fork Coalition, Jennifer Harrington, the Director of the University of Montana's Native American Natural Resource Program, Sarah Christensen, Area Rancher with Pintler Mountain Beef, and Travis Kraft, longtime local fly fishing guide and business owner. Also facilitating the panel with me was the event's co-host, Jesse Thomas, of Sustainable Wellness, who is a keeper of so much knowledge around the connections of community well-being, personal health, and food systems. We did have a sold-out show with 90 folks at the Roxy Theater in Missoula, and I do want to thank David Millslow and Lizzie Archer at the Roxy and the International Wildlife Film Festival for hosting this gathering there. And a shout out to the local radio station, Trail 103.3, for helping us get the word out. On this brisk November evening a few months ago, I feel like there was an unspoken hunger for people to connect. Or maybe it was just me. It was the week after the election, and more so the end of a long campaign year, where we all experienced around-the-clock bombardment of ads and rhetoric that was hell-bent on division and exhaustive mudslinging from all sides. A core intent of this discussion was to learn about some examples of community-guided and collaborative efforts taking place in regards to Missoula area rivers, and therefore the people connected to them, and to speak honestly about the challenges in that, as well as the payoffs when you keep at it and find ways to work together. In the discussion, we also wanted to share glimpses into some of the perspectives whose lives connect to these rivers, to inspire ways for folks to engage, but also empathize with all of the moving parts that contribute to a healthy community and watershed. We first hear from Brian Chaffin, Executive Director of the Clark Fork Coalition. Prior to his role with the coalition, Brian was a professor of water policy at the University of Montana, and he was involved in research that aimed to disentangle elements of the human-water relationship to better understand potential pathways for managing water sustainably into the future. The Clark Fork Coalition, formed in 1985 as a group of community members who came together to stop the dumping of toxins into the Clark Fork River by the Smurfit Stone pulp mill that sat just downstream from Missoula. 40 years later, the Clark Fork Coalition still holds a mission to protect and restore the Clark Fork watershed in a way that always opens more doors for community involvement and collaboration. They do a lot, some of which includes conducting research, lending legal expertise, and leading education programs for all ages. They've been a key presence in evaluating the nation's largest Superfund cleanup, located in the Upper Clark Fork, and are actively involved in tracking the cleanup of the Smurfit Stone pulp mill site that we just mentioned that sits on the banks of the Clark Fork River downstream of Missoula. I asked Brian about a collaborative effort that he's been involved with called the Upper Clark Fork Streamflow Group. It's a working group that brings folks together to address a roughly 100-mile stretch of the Clark Fork River, from the headwaters around Butte down to the confluence with Rock Creek. Their collective goals include building a clear understanding of water use and streamflow challenges, and to determine actions to be initiated by the participants to benefit streamflows during the critical times. There has consistently been lower flows, specifically in late summer, in this stretch of the Clark Fork River, which, of course, creates tensions all around. Many stakeholders are at the table for the streamflow group, including area ranchers and irrigators, state agencies, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and universities. Brian facilitated these group discussions for 2.5 years, but now that he's the ED of Clark Fork Coalition, he continues to attend as a participant representing CFC. I asked Brian to share about the approach and process of this effort and what the realistic challenges were.
They came together because there was something on the horizon that the Upper Clark Fork has been getting lower and lower during the late summer season, early fall, which causes challenges for fish. You all probably know that overlaid on this is a huge contamination event in 1908 when a flood of record distributed mine waste contamination from Butte and Anaconda across that floodplain. So not only is the river getting lower, there's also a toxicity in a lot of parts of that landscape that dilution is the solution to pollution, whether we like it or not sometimes. And so those two things interact in really interesting ways up there. And so there was a lot of issues on the table, and there's been great work done in the basin by NGOs, state agencies, tribes, irrigators, local community groups for years. But they were in a kind of period of a lull, and increasing drought and changing climate pressures really was what drove people to the table. So if we talk about the process, one of the things I would emphasize is there has to be a reason why people want to come to the table. And then the next piece of kind of process that I'd highlight from this group is that we sat together and we came up with a set of common ground rules for operating with each other. Why are we here? What do we want? What's the 80% of the things that we can all agree that we want out of this group together? And let's set the 20% that we can't agree on over here. And we may get to it, but let's focus first on the 80%. And during the time in which we focused on that 80%, people got to know each other and they became comfortable with each other. And we had barbecues and we got together, and people spent more time going to these meetings than they normally would, because they actually wanted to see the partners. And you could see this in the film, right? You could see some of that camaraderie kind of develop. And from there, trust was built, relationships were built, and conversations were had on the side and outside meetings and for a beer afterwards or for a burger for lunch after a meeting that actually spawned projects or inspired projects and other collaborations that didn't have to be formal with the group, and actually brought money into the basin to do stream flow projects that actually increase stream flow during times of year, or to bring education on different issues that we could all kind of participate in to the room. And so we've had a lot of success, not because we're this awesome formal group with this great decision-making process, but because we're just an information sharing group that has led to many conversations amongst the partners that are involved in the group. So I don't want to take up too much time, but there's a couple places to start there. And it's also not all pretty. There are people in the room that respect each other and that come to the meetings and that talk to each other that are in lawsuits against each other, have different sovereign values. That the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes have a water right that, as of April 2025, could call on the water of many of the irrigators that are sitting in the room. But that doesn't take away from the respect and the dialogue that is in that room and the trust that we've built with each other to try to work through some of these challenges. So.
Thank you, Brian. Yeah, and that's important to note, right? That it's not like, oh, we've created this ideal, table that everyone can come to, and everyone says yes on the first ask, right? Far from that. And so just to be honest about those realistic challenges, and that's okay, but it takes that perseverance and passion to keep showing up and learning how to listen, and that we're not always right, and letting our egos at the door. Thank you.
Now we go to Jennifer Harrington. Jennifer is the director of the University of Montana's Native American Natural Resource Program. She's an enrolled member of the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa. She grew up in Missoula and is on the board of many entities connecting to community and environmental health. I asked Jennifer about the focus of her master's thesis, which looks at the consultation process between federally recognized tribes and the EPA on Superfund sites. For her research, she looked specifically at the involvement of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes with the Superfund site, the previously mentioned Smurfit Stone pulp mill site, which, as we mentioned, is right on the banks of the Clark Fork River, just downstream from Missoula. The mill site closed its doors in 2010, but it was in operation for over 50 years and created a component used for corrugated cardboard. But still today sits 800 acres of unlined sludge ponds that are filled to the brim with toxic waste, all in the floodplain of the Clark Fork River, and a stone's throw from the main channel. There's been a great deal of voiced concern and meetings involving residents, agencies, and the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes to put pressure on the EPA to clean up the site. This input from folks on the ground includes the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group, which Jennifer remains actively involved with. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes were a fair voice to be at the decision-making table, regardless of the fact that it was not on reservation land, as the entirety of the Clark Fork River goes through their Aboriginal homeland from thousands of years back, and the cultural connections of the waters tie to the present day for tribal members. In addition to that, on a legal level, the tribes hold treaty rights to fish from and access this river. In Jennifer's thesis, she says how it was apparent from her research and observations that the Superfund process was not built to include too many partners. I asked Jennifer what she witnessed with the design of the Superfund process that restricted authentic consultation with and the inclusion of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, and if there was any takeaways for finding improved methods going forward.
The process in which I engaged in my research followed Indigenous research methodologies and methods, which required that and helped guide me in building relationships with the tribes before this started, to make sure that this was something that the members of the tribe wanted to participate in and be a part of. So I did presentations for the Culture Council and had many questions and conversations with elders about this, and some of the elders would reflect immediately, why are you doing this? We've never been at the table and our voice is not meaningfully heard. But they were still interested in understanding how there could be change. And Shelley Fyant, who was a tribal council member at the time, really encouraged this research and brought me to elder meetings and helped me establish that relationship, and then also went to the tribal council to get their permission as well. And then over time, building the relationships, I really learned. I grew up here in Missoula, surrounded by Superfund sites. I grew up on the north side, and White Pine and Sash was going. I think there were 5 mills going when I was a child, and you could taste and smell the air. But when I did the interviews with the tribal members, Missoula took a whole new shape. The way this valley was, the five valleys, pristine, bull trout teeming in all of the waterways. And it wasn't that long ago. And so it really made me reflect on how quickly we can degrade a place by our choices. And that responsibility to make sure that all voices are at the table in a collaborative space, to make sure that we can address this, because it impacts everyone. And a lot of the chemicals that are in the Clark Fork are legacy. They're going to, they bioaccumulate over time and they don't break down very quickly. So that's an impact that the generations down the road will have to bear. But then I went to so many, and Brian attended some of those same meetings at Frenchtown with the EPA. The dialogue from the agency was, though they said they were very much guided by science, the science guidance had an end point. For instance, how many parts per million exposure is safe before 1 in 100,000 get cancer? The science says, well, this exposure will get that. But the application of what we'll do to that space is not science-based. It's based on the potentially responsible parties' pressure and legal power, and it's based on agency discretion. And it has only what we're hoping at the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group is to make sure that everything that happens along the Superfund route has everyone's voices firmly at the table, that we have an impact on what's going to happen. We had a discussion just last week at our community advisory meeting with he's the epidemiologist, to understand what the risk to human health is. And there are, they said it's in EPA language, acceptable cancer risks that are allowed in a cleanup process. So the tribes recently, the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, challenged this Columbia Falls proposed cleanup plan, which would leave waste in place. And these are toxic, long-lived chemicals. To me, it didn't seem like science, again, was not being applied. It was shifting the burden from the potentially responsible parties to the people in the place. And so again and again, I have yet to see a real collaborative effort being made. It feels a bit condescending when we're at these meetings and we work. All of our hours are volunteer. We've had some amazing collaborators with Elena Evans at the Missoula Health Department and doing incredible research to help us understand what the risks are. And yet, at the last meeting, they were saying if we add, because PCBs were found where they said they wouldn't be found, but that was because of pressure that we've been putting on for years. And they're saying, well, it might take an extra year if we add this to the chemicals of concern. Like, what? That makes no sense as far as they have the science, but the application, again, is missing that key component.
Thank you. How frequently does that group meet?
We meet once a month. It's the first Thursday of every month at the Frenchtown Fire Hall. And everyone is welcome.
Everyone's welcome. Thank you, Jennifer. And like I said, just Google ScholarWorks Jennifer Harrington. Her thesis, even just the abstract, it gives you good insight into just the beginning of the process and how things can be improved. And it's telling of so many other processes out there.
We now hear from Jesse Thomas,
who will ask a question to Sarah Christensen. Sarah and her husband Josh run their ranch operation, Pintler Mountain Beef. Her and her husband's approach to ranching is to do it in a way that prioritizes the health of the land and the greater ecosystem, which of course includes the waterways and all elements of the watershed. They also approach their operation in a way that prioritizes care for the cattle and for the health of the community members that their meat nourishes. They use 0 hormones or antibiotics on their cows, and it's all delivered direct from Sarah and Josh themselves to their consumers. Sarah admits it's not easy, but she seems determined to have her ranch be an extension of her passion of growing people's awareness of that connection between our food systems, human health, landscape health, community vitality, and local economies. And just a note, when Jessie asks her question to Sarah here, Jessie mentions absentee landowners. This term refers to people, usually very wealthy people, who buy what used to be a family ranch and use it as a second or third home, and then they're only there for a short period of the year. Of course, anyone can do what they want with their property, but this trend is increasing across the West, and it not only drives up land costs so that locals can't afford to stay or new folks can't afford to get into agriculture, but it also means that that home is not occupied by someone who's an active part of the community, typically. They're not sending their kids to the school or serving on the local volunteer fire department or the many other boards that keep a town going. All these things are especially felt in a rural community, and it leads to the degradation of that community. Okay, here's Jessie asking Sarah her question.
So this evening, we aim to shed light on how intertwined community well-being is with the health of the landscapes. You are a rancher, a mother, and a community member who takes their role of land stewardship and producing healthy food seriously. Your cattle operation is outside of Phillipsburg. You've said many times your neighbors who have been longtime family ranchers are now being pressured to sell their land to wealthy out-of-state buyers who aren't in agriculture and are largely absentee landowners. Can you help us connect the dots about the loss of community, increased cost of living, and other social pressures for food producers in the state of Montana? What are your challenges, and how can people show up for you and other land stewarding food producers like Pintler Mountain Beef?
Hi, thank you for the question. So we are 5th generation on a ranch outside of Phillipsburg, Montana. And recently we've just had a huge influx of out-of-state money. They're buying entire ranches. And like our adjacent neighbor is Kelly Clarkston, the pop singer. And one basic thing that changes is that Granite County's taxes went up by 80%. We are not a community that makes a lot of money just due to the structure of how cattle ranching is. Most beef that we eat in the United States is brought in from Brazil, and then all of our cattle that's raised in the United States goes to China and Japan because we consistently raise some of the best beef in the world, and so other countries will pay a higher premium. So there are strategic times where they collapse the cattle market so to lower our price, or like what we'd get for our animals. And so why people continue to do it is because you are connected to the land, that there's a greater payout than just money, that there's stewardship, there's connection, and there's love. And so, you determine that path because, you're a human and we're all gonna die. So like, what do you wanna do with your life? And so we're the 5th generation putting our hat in the rink, and it's the most daunting time. When my husband was raised, there was 3 other cattle ranches in the family, so there was a broader support system, so then it wasn't just 2 people. And now it's my husband and I that are caretaking the land. We have spent $10,000 with an adjacent landowner that's a billionaire that moved in to just be able to maintain our rights, being able to get out of our ranch. And so there's a lot of things that have changed just from 2020. Another thing is like things like cleaning ditches. So we need to clean our waterways so our water can move through so we can irrigate our pastures. They don't want to let us access the ditches that we've had water rights on for 100+ years because they don't see the land in the same way. They see it in this fenced separated environment, that they own that. They don't see it as like how the elk see it, how they travel and move, like the water moves. We just get to steward it in our life. It's such a cultural difference that then that disseminates out into this broader theme of like, everybody's out for themselves. Everybody's really predatory about how they view the elk and their migration patterns. And so right now, it's really hard. It's like there's a second wave of now rural white America is being colonized, and you don't know what to do. You just keep putting one foot in front of the next and try and be as strategic. And for our family, we want our ranch to be intact 100 years from now. And so we try and take steps to reflect that. But every aspect of it makes it hard to do it because you don't have peers anymore. It's my husband and I and our 80-year-old cousin that helps us brand often, unless people feel like they're nostalgic, gonna go help out of branding. And I guess what I wish people would know is that agriculture and cows keep the open spaces. So if you find hunting and views that are not disrupted by human intervention, small family ranches are maintaining that. They're predicting $24 trillion worth of land is going to transfer in the next 20 years. Where do we think that's going to go? It's going to go to the wealthy. I mean, at this point, nobody can afford to go into it. And then I guess the other thing is that your individual choices matter, because if you believe in yourself and you see value in eating clean food and being in clean environments and those things that I think should be basic rights, then have your choices reflect that. If you want a community that's filled with local, distinct, intelligent businesses, then select for that. Because what's coming in is that all of this homogenization of culture, which is like Starbucks and all of these chains and all of everything down reserve, if that's where you spend your money, then that's what kind of culture you're gonna foster. Our choices do matter, and how you treat yourself and what you want in your life are gonna reflect in our greater society. And so, I don't know, go to a farmer's market.
Or better yet, just source straight from the farmer or rancher so that they can have a weekend too. I'm just going to add that in.
Adding a note here that folks can purchase directly from Pintler Mountain Beef. You can check out their offerings at pintlermountainbeef.com. They ship anywhere, as well as do Saturday markets in the Missoula area and deliveries to hubs around western and into central Montana. You can track these delivery opportunities on their Instagram at Pintler Mountain Beef. And for orders, Sarah says she actually prefers folks to just pick up the phone and give her a call, 406-550-2841. Now we move on to our fourth and final panelist, Travis Kraft. Travis has been a fishing and whitewater guide for over 20 years, and he's the owner and operator of Thunder Hammer Fly Fishing. He guides and spends most days year-round on the Bitterroot, Blackfoot, Clark Fork, and Missouri rivers. Of course, a healthy river and fish populations are priceless, but it's also the cornerstone of much of Montana's economy. In 2020, it was estimated that the economic value to Montana of expenditures from fishing activity alone is over $900 million annually, rippling out from direct payments to guides and local guide shops, as well as revenue to hotels and accommodations, restaurants, gas stations, grocery stores, transportation, and so on. Here's Jessie again, asking a question of Travis.
As a guide and a father with an outlook on the horizon for both your business and your family, I know you impose your own hoot owl restrictions when temperatures are high, even when it's not mandated. For those of us who are not on the Missoula area rivers every day over the course of multiple months, can you paint a picture for us from your perspective? What are you seeing with the changes from increased recreation to privatization of river access, increasing temperatures, and drought conditions? How are these seemingly separate events impacting the aquatic environment and, in turn, your livelihood?
So I'll tag on. Does everyone know what hoot owl is? Okay, so brief synopsis. We can only fish till 2 in the afternoon, from midnight to 2 in the afternoon, when water temperatures reach certain thresholds. The reason is it reduces stress. And this goes back to where we talk about science. Okay, so if a river meets this certain criteria, all different river sections have different criteria, then hoot owl gets imposed. Well, when you're out there every day and fishing different sections of river here in Missoula, I got on the Missouri, I got on the 3 freestones here, the Bitterroot, the Clark Fork, and the Blackfoot. You can see the difference in how the fish are reacting on a day-to-day basis. As those water temperatures heat up, they're less active, they start getting lethargic, and there are days now that I call it at noon because I also carry a temperature. I carry a thermometer with me. And when that thermometer hits a threshold for me, like 67, I'll dip it in the water and there we go, we're done. The other thing is I've dipped my thermometer in the water and said, oh, it's still 64, but I'm watching how the fish are reacting and I go, oh, we're done. You know, and the other thing that's happening is I have a lot of repeat clients that fish just with me. I also hire other guides to take out other clients. I'm a smaller outfitter, and I have this one group that I've been fishing now with close to 17 years, something like that. Both their kids I taught to fish. One was 10 and one was 12. And now both of them are graduated from college. And this last time, they always come in the last week in June and early July. And you know how on your iPhone or your phone you get those photo memories that pop up? Well, Doug goes, Travis, look, here's the photo memories. So if you look through those 17 years that we have, you see puffy jackets. Same time of year, you have puffy jackets, waders, and then as you get closer and closer to where we are now, it's flip-flops, sandals, bright sun, not raining. And so this is anecdotal, you know, I mean, climate is this long-term thing, but that's 17 years that you can see this drastic shift of what now we're dealing with. And they're not coming back this year. We're going over to the Missouri in May because they don't want to deal with getting off the river early. They want to go back to what it was, where we had fun in those experiences. And I've stopped booking trips for the last week in July through the first 3 weeks of August. I'm starting to look at alternative methods. I'm booking my shoulder seasons a lot more heavy than what we used to be able to rely on. The other thing is the rivers now are extremely crowded. Part of it is definitely I'm part of the problem. You know, people want to fish. They want to come. Missoula is a fantastic place. But the other thing is you also drive around this town. How many boats do we have? Everyone has a boat. There's a huge new influx of population, and now it's trying to figure out on how we're all going to work. I also now, with a lot of my clients, we may not go to the same sections I know that fishing would be fantastic, but we'll go to a different section where we won't see as many people. Because what guiding is for me and what I try to incorporate is it's an experience. It's looking at the water. It's maybe taking that time, watching that osprey dive and take a fish just downstream as your front angler's super frustrated because he can't catch a fish. You know, I mean, that's part of it. Watching that herd of elk cross the river in front of you, dropping the anchor and watching things. It's an overall experience, and that's what my clients want. And, you know, the other problem, though, is when you stop taking trips, there's also another person that'll take them. And are they going to be as ethical and treat the river with as much respect? So it's a double-edged sword.
And thank you, Travis. And it's also a case of it's not exactly what's said, it's who says it. You have Dale on screen, who his whole livelihood is fishing and getting people out there. And he's the one to say, this has impact. And so I think it's also just normalizing that it's okay, like we might feel stigmas from our profession or the group of people that we're in our own community to verbalize something, but we can't address what we're not talking about. And so how important it is it can feel like sticking our neck out there maybe sometimes, but let's be real. These things aren't benign. Is there a response that we can do that works for all parties? So thank you, Travis. Thanks for sharing that.
I will interject here to say that all of Travis's sentiments and observations he shared are more and more things that I've heard other guides around the state echo. People who make their entire livelihood from being on the river, who are making daily observations for much of the year, that there are noticeable impacts on the health of fisheries due to a changing climate. And though it costs them a great financial loss, some of them do impose their own hoot owls to prioritize the long-term well-being of those fish populations. Also, I think most Montanans have observed this, the rapid increase of river recreation numbers, and people who want to be honest that it's not a benign concept. In the Upper Yellowstone River film episode of Life in the Land, Dale Sexton, the co-owner of Dan Bailey's outdoor company in Livingston, is very open about that, knowing that that's the business he's in. And it's not just the increase in river traffic creating more trash and waste and erosion on the rivers or stress to the fish, but just the presence of mass amounts of people displaces the wildlife that require these river corridors to be their sanctuary. There is such value in being open about discussing these realities. As we mentioned in that film, the Upper Yellowstone watershed group there, which brings together area ranchers, conservation groups, recreation businesses, agencies, and more, conducted a multi-year study of recreation on this stretch of the river so that they can have the data to properly inform a community-guided response that works for all stakeholders. Not easy, but at least the conversations and the actions and the proactive responses are in motion. Now going back to our recorded discussion, this is myself asking another question to the panel.
I wonder if we can quick, I know there might be many points on this, but if you can give me one friction point related to your work, and that could be related to dealing with bureaucracy, agencies, trying to get more public engagement, that would help your work to move forward more effectively, if you can tell us what one of those friction points are in a way that those could be shifted to kind of help your work to move forward more effectively.
Here is Sarah with Pintler Mountain Beef answering the question.
Something that I'm observing is that agriculture is essential. Right now, there's a concerted effort saying that agriculture is cause of climate change, which we can obviously observe that it's the combustion of fossil fuels. But agriculture, and I don't mean like big Bill Gates conglomerate, what I mean here in Montana is that they're the keepers of the open space. And, they're families just like you and I. And so they're complex, but they show up and they work hard. And so it doesn't have to be viewed as adversarial as the kind of broader narrative that we're seeing, that how we vote and how we think about things, like one thing that could be an effective tool for us to do better as a group is if the Stalkers and Packyard Act was enforced, or country of origin labeling. Right, and as of right now, people can import beef from Brazil and then be like carcasses and then be cut and wrapped in the United States and it called American beef. There's also no oversight of like for us, there's certain periods of time before, let's say, a pesticide or an antibiotic, like pesticides on grains that are fed out to cows and or an antibiotic given to a cow. There's a waiting period. And then there's, I think maybe not great enforcement, but there is enforcement of it. None of that's happening in Brazil. And so it's just agriculture and family ranches are not the cause of what's going on in the world. And I just wish that people saw the view of that this is like an old, people tend the land and they see the land and you commune with it and you have a relationship with it. And if we start moving these people out of our lives and saying that job isn't important, that's not important, then where's the direction of our planet, of our country, of our day-to-day lives if we're not even eating food that's being raised regionally within our area. Because if agriculture is vertically integrated, which is the hopes by the Big Four, all of our ranches would be gone. And I think that would impact quality of life in Montana. So, I think it's worth it for people to kind of be aware and to think and vote in accordance to that.
Thank you, Sarah. Yeah. A note here, when Sarah refers to the Big Four, or when you hear the term Big Ag, it's these large conglomerates, which over the decades have merged to grow larger and hold more control over the actions and profits of local farmers and our food systems. These conglomerates hold power at all stages of agriculture, from the seeds to the fertilizer and pesticide, the meat packers, the distribution, the transportation, and even the grocery chains. Now back to the panel. Sarah just passed the mic back to myself. Yeah, and I hope things of what Sarah just said, it's not like, oh, well, that's Sarah's problem. That's all of ours. We can talk about it with our friends. We have power to keep those conversations going. Seeds that she planted, talk about that with people. Talk about it with your legislators. Anyone else want to share a specific friction point that they think could be shifted that could help their work move forward more effectively? Brian Chaffin with the Clark Fork Coalition takes the mic, saying that he has more so an opportunity to share. He refers to a line in the Upper Yellowstone River film that was said by a gentleman, Scott Fraser. Scott says in the film, quote, "There's not a thing on this planet that the water doesn't love. It is the total expression. It will even change its state to include you." Here's Brian.
But I took that to illustrate the generosity of the river and the natural world. And I think that we can show, and from my view from the Clark Fork Coalition, but also as my views and values as a human, is we can show that generosity back by getting engaged and being involved. And there are so many different ways, from the things that Wendy talked about and Travis and Jen with Smurfit, that you can be engaged. There's so many different ways. The Frenchtown Community Advisory Group meets the first Thursday of every month. You can show up to those meetings and learn what you can do. You can come volunteer for the Clark Fork Coalition. You can volunteer with Trout Unlimited. You can make choices about where your food comes from. So I think actually taking ownership, as Travis really pointed out, of the places that we are and be is a friction point in my work. We could use a lot more engagement. It takes everybody to govern ourselves and our relationship with the natural world. So,
thank you, Brian. Travis or Jennifer, do you want to talk about a specific point in your work?
Well, my biggest fear as a father and as a sportsman and an outfitter is that as we lose as more and more people move here, we have a different change of values. And one thing that we all have to remember, and this comes back to engagement, our stream access law for the state of Montana is written right into our state constitution. It started in the early 70s. It's one of the most, if you look at other places in the West, other states, it's completely different. We, as all individuals, have equal access if we enter from a public area through the high water mark. And that, in the next 10 years, is something that you all should pay attention to and get engaged. And that's where I find a lot of friction, because I see places that have changed hands, and now I see no trespassing signs on beaches in the high water mark that I used to do lunches on for years and years. So that's where I see the next friction point. And that doesn't matter if you're an outfitter, a rancher, or whatever. That's all of ours as people in Montana.
Just to echo what Travis said there have been many efforts to dismantle Montana's stream access law, which gives anyone access to a river below the high water line, so that a landowner can't block off an entire stretch of the river to the public, as does happen in other states legally. Also, just to note that the Montana Constitution as a whole, which includes this and many other core concepts for citizen rights and our environment. In 2030, the question will be on all Montanans' ballots, asking us if we want to call for a state constitutional convention, which would mean a rewriting of our state constitution. And with an increasing presence of privatization interests in the state, those interests could make sure that they're involved in the rewriting of our Constitution. So keep an eye out on that and let others know about this coming down the pike. Now, here is Jennifer Harrington answering the question about friction points.
Well, there are so many friction points, but I think the one that I hope shifts, because there's already been established benefit from listening to all stakeholders for whatever is going on, whether that be community growth, access to rivers, or a clean and healthy environment that we are also guaranteed in our Constitution. But when, as I've said, the tribes right now and all stakeholders really don't have, it just doesn't feel like yet there's impact. And the friction is, again, about money and the PRPs, the potentially responsible parties. But for instance, on the Clark Fork River, in 2013, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks did a fish tissue study that discovered PCBs and dioxins in the fish tissue. So they established a consumption warning, which was 1 per month, I think, of rainbow trout and no of the pike, northern pike. But we went back, and then the tribes, Confederation Kootenai tribes, brought up that they consume the entire fish, and in a lot of these contaminants, they bioaccumulate, especially in fatty tissue. So it took monumental effort and the help of John Tester to get the EPA to allow Fish, Wildlife, and Parks and the potentially responsible parties working together to gather more fish data, and they did a whole fish. And now the no consumption warning is no consumption because the levels were higher than is safe, and it extends for over 200 river miles along the Clark Fork. The tribes coming forward and having, we had to, they really had to come back and back and back, but it's protective of everyone. And that's, I think, what I would like to see happen again. And the same is being said of the Columbia Falls. If they make a record of decision, it should be for the most protective action possible, because that will enable us to. So there's mine.
Sure. Thank you, Jennifer. Yeah, and I think there's through lines of what everyone has been saying here, what I've seen around the state, that it's this value of having local people driving the bus. Because before you know it, you're going to blink and it's just a bunch of, 18-wheelers barreling down, driving everything. And so it's really important to support those people who are making sure that locally driven bus stays operating. That's something that all of us can do, is just help those who are trying to keep that going, because you'll blink and it's hard to come back from. So a woman in the audience then asks a question which the audio was too quiet to make out for playback here. But she says how she's very concerned about public access, that she's grown up here and she was able to access local areas that she can't access anymore, and is seeing more and more private signs in those places. So what is a take-home that anyone on the panel has for her of what can be done? Travis Kraft answers the question here.
The biggest thing is there's a couple different organizations. There's actually Mitchell Slough, which is a huge debate. For everyone who doesn't know about Mitchell Slough, Huey Lewis is one of the stakeholders down there on the Bitterroot River. It's an 18-mile side channel of the Bitterroot. And there was just a proposition brought in front of the River Valley board to put floating islands in Mitchell Slough. And that happened 4 days ago, I believe, or 2 days ago. It's just extremely recent. There's a couple different organizations. Report where you see those, and they will do the background search.
A note that the entity to report these to is the PLWA, Public Land Water Access Association. They work statewide in regards to both public land access and public water access. And their link is in this episode's show notes. They're a big stakeholder in that stream access law. And with those, that's the place to report that, and they will dig into that. You just document it, send pictures, and then
you use OnX at all? OnX is a mapping thing. I use it for hunting. I use it for GPS. It's fantastic because it shows land ownership. So it actually shows what property lines and boundaries are.
Here is a question from an audience member.
We've had a few comments now about the science not informing policy as quickly as it should be, whether that be for hoot owl restrictions or for how we respond to the chemicals in the water. And I'm a biologist and I'm a teacher, and so I'm wondering if any of the members of the panel have a message to the future biologists about how would you like to respond and interact with them as stakeholders and collaborators.
Travis Kraft answers here.
So the head biologist for FWP, who was fantastic with working with outfitters and all of that, she was just recently resigned after she was kind of pushed out of the last administration. Interacting with her and a lot of the biologists in the regions that I work in has been well received. They're open to some feedback, but it's also looking at who's driving the decision-making process without just using science and holding those people accountable is my take home.
And here is Brian Chaffin with Clark Fork Coalition answering that question.
Yeah, if I had to say one thing to future biologists and wildlife professionals in the room, and I know there are some, is that that profession is no longer, the effectiveness of that profession is no longer just in the field and behind the computer analyzing the data. That profession is in the field, behind the computer, and at the public meeting. And it's a bigger, broader profession than that, because that effective communication that continues to happen with people that are either working in the landscape, on the land, with the agencies, with decision makers, that's how that information just gets communicated in a positive way and in an effective way.
Here is Jennifer Harrington answering the question, speaking to the action around the Smurfit Stone Superfund site.
And I'll just share that with the Frenchtown Community Advisory Group, we have biologists that are very much helping us and informing us and they are place-based compared to the Environmental Protection Agency's biologists who are either from Denver or Washington, D.C. And that has made a visible difference.
Yeah, I'll echo too that that voice, I would check out the Life and Land films, both the Big Hole Valley and the Central Montana Plains we hear from FWP and Fish and Wildlife Service. And they talk about how did they gain the trust of the people that live on the landscape? And there's an awesome FWP guy working here in the Upper Yellowstone. We just didn't have time to also feature that voice. But yeah, check out those two films because you will get a blip of this is how it can look when it can be done right. Yeah. And here is the event's co-host, Jesse Thomas, with Sustainable Wellness.
I just wanted to add in something because I am in nutrition and I get beat up on this all the time. You're talking about industry-funded science from giant multinational corporations, and then there's science from data that's collected on the ground. It's very different science. Like we've made science a bad word, and it's not. But it is when it's a giant multinational company that's like, here's our data, and here's our team of lawyers, and you guys can pound sand, because that happens.
There was one more comment from the audience, which again, the audio was unfortunately inaudible for this recording. But someone in the audience did say how they're big fans of the collaborative efforts taking place in the Upper Yellowstone and in the Clark Fork watershed and elsewhere, but that it does need to be acknowledged that collaboration is not always the most effective approach to create impact, that many efforts have and continue to require litigation, policy change, and more pointed advocacy to create change. Sometimes even getting the ability to engage in the first place came about from litigation or policy change. I'm really glad that this person brought this up. It's a valid point that I happen to agree with. And it did remind me to clarify that in the Life and the Land films or these types of conversations, when I aim to uplift the value in collaborative approaches, I know that this is not the end-all be-all, best approach for every instance. There are examples everywhere of collaboration being attempted and failing, or flat out not being effective or appropriate for the certain instance. This is reality. I suppose I more so aim to give the narrative of collaboration, which can take many forms, and its value, a chance at the spotlight in the midst of the extremely dominant public narrative that the only way is pitting one entity or sector or community against the other. And yes, there's a time and a place for litigation, for sure. And I will stand by my belief that no, we don't have to put the label of, quote, collaboration on it. In fact, I prefer we don't put rigid labels on how we interact as humans. But I believe the long-lasting, meaningful impacts will always come from a process where multiple perspectives are present, humility and open-mindedness is present, and where we are truly listening to one another. And yes, even when, if not especially when, we're approaching policy. That may seem like a distant concept at this point, but I think we can all step up in our own circles, personally and professionally, and remind each other how integrating these values of humility and open-mindedness, listening to multiple perspectives, of just how powerful that approach can be. Thank you so much to Jennifer Harrington, Brian Chaffin, Sarah Christensen, Travis Kraft, and Jesse Thomas for your work and for sharing with us for this gathering. Thank you to Sustainable Wellness for co-hosting. Thank you to the International Wildlife Film Festival and the Roxy Theater for hosting us. You can find links to everything mentioned here in this episode's show notes. And thank you all for listening. We appreciate it if you're able to share this episode with others, drop us a rating, and subscribe to the Stories for Action podcast. Shout out to the Life in the Land Project, which is a series of films and podcasts produced under Stories for Action. All Life in the Land content is free and available at lifeintheland.org. Reach out if you'd like to screen a film for free to kick off deeper dialogue on these topics in your community, organization, or classroom. We can also share with you our free curriculum that accompanies the films. Find out more about all of our work, including film production and story workshops, at storiesforaction.org. And check us out on Instagram and Facebook at Stories for Action. Thank you so much for being a part of our community, where our mission is to use the power of storytelling to spark positive connections and advance a thriving planet for all.